Hey everyone, welcome to another video. Today I'm going to be making a shaker card for the Clair Stamps July Challenge. Now I have made shaker cards before, a few of them actually. I'll leave a link to one in the top right hand corner. But today I'm going to be making this card for the Clair Stamp Challenge, and there are a few rules you do need to follow for that challenge. I promise it's super simple. All you need to do is create a card or project using the photo that I'm going to show you as inspiration. You post your project and link to the Clair blog. Any brand of stamps is acceptable, but we do love to see Clair stamps. Here is a look at the inspiration photo for this month. It is very patriotic and it is very July themed, if you will. So I'm going to be using this as my inspiration for my card today. Also, winners are chosen on the last day of every month and are posted on the Clair blog. Now, a few other things to know. You must link directly to the Clair Stamps blog in your post. Your projects must be new, no backlinking to old projects that you've done before. The number of entries or times you can enter is unlimited, so make as many cards as you want or projects as you want, and add a direct link to the end links on the Clair blog. That link will be in the description box below. It's that simple. So let's get started on the shaker card. I'm going to be using this stamp set from Clair Stamps. It's called Anchor of Hope. I'm going to be using on the outside of the card that little anchor, and I'm also going to be using that seaweed. I went ahead and made some masks with Ink-a-Dink-a-Doo masking paper. All I do with that is I stamp the stamp on the masking paper on the white side, use my scissors, just some fine blade scissors to trim that out, and they are ready to go. It's that simple. Now I want to do a bit of stenciling on the background of my card. I'm actually doing this directly on the card base. My card base is an A2 top folding card base, and I flipped it horizontally. I have made this from white cardstock. I've got a video all about making card bases. Again, I will leave that in the top right hand corner if you want to go check that out. I'm using this stencil that kind of reminds me of waves in water. I'm going to speed this up a little bit. I'm using Mermaid Lagoon Distress Ink, and I am blending this on. Now, I'm blending on pretty heavily here, so I'm not worried about really blending in these colors very well. And to be honest, the very center of this card is going to be completely covered, so I'm not even going to worry about blending into the center of the card very much at all. I'll actually leave a little bit of white in there. Now, even though I have the stencil on the card, which I have taped onto the back of the card, that way it doesn't shift around on me or move, I like to use a little bit of scrap paper to put my fingers down so I don't leave fingerprints in some of those larger areas where I'm blending on some of that ink. Now, if you wanted to remake this card and make it a little bit more fancy, you could always blend in a couple different colors of ink, make it darker towards the center or darker towards the outer edges, and then make it lighter towards the inside. But I'm going for more of an easy card because I already am going to put a lot of work into the shaker. So I'm just going to go ahead and sponge this on very quickly, and you can see I'm leaving that white space right in the center. I went ahead and pulled my die over for just a second to make sure I left the center where it needed to be and I didn't have any white space showing. Once I had it to where I wanted it, I can peel off that stencil and I have this beautiful background on my card base that is ready to go. That's all I'm going to be doing on the card base. The rest of the work is actually going to be done on some die cuts that I'll go ahead and make with this die that I made sure fit over that white area. I want to first cut this die from some watercolor paper. I will be using some watercolor pencils for coloring. If you wanted to use any other coloring medium, just make sure you cut this with the paper that your coloring medium plays well with. Next, I'm going to go ahead and use that same die and cut it from a piece of craft cardstock. I will be using the frame from this die cut and then the center of watercolor paper to fit inside that craft frame. I'll be doing all of my stamping on the watercolor paper, so I am using an ink that is actually heat embossable. This is the VersaFine Nocturne ink. You can use a regular ink that just plays well with water if you wanted to, but I'm going to go ahead and heat emboss. That way I get that little bit of a well to help me with my watercoloring and keeping it contained. Anytime I do watercolor, because I am not very good at it, anytime I do it, it seems to want to bleed on me, and this just is a little bit of a barrier to help me along the way. I stamped two of those little seaweeds first, and I'm going to be heat embossing these with some clear embossing powder. This is my favorite way to do black heat embossing, but there are a few different ways if you wanted to. This is just my personal favorite. You could always use a Versa mark ink if you wanted to, and then use black embossing powder. I like to use a black pigment ink and then use a clear embossing powder. I went ahead and heat set both of those, and then I'll use one of my little massive seaweed. I just pulled off the blue backing paper. I put that right over the little seaweed that I want to mask out, and I'll be bringing in the anchor and stamping that next, and it's going to make it look as if it's a little bit behind that seaweed. So I'll go slightly up from where I stamped the seaweed, and then just stamp it off to the left a little bit. Now before I heat emboss, I want to go ahead and remove that mask, and I did prep my surface with my powder tool the first time. The second time I put down my mask and then prep my surface. That's going to help your mask last a little bit longer. Now once I heat embossed the little anchor, it was time to start coloring. I'm going to be using the Imagine Crafts watercolor pencils. I will leave a link up in the top right hand corner of a review I did on these and the colored pencils, which I'll be using later on in the video to color the inside of my card actually. But I'm going to go ahead and start some coloring. I'm going to speed this up in just a moment, but first I want to show you how these work. All you do is use them like you would a regular colored pencil. You don't need a whole lot of pigment down at first. It's actually better if you work in layers with these. So just put down a little bit of color. I'm starting with my darkest here, and I've got some water brushes off to the side. Now this set does come with a brush that you can load up with water just like a regular paintbrush. However, it's not my favorite if I'm being 100% honest here. So I like to use my water brushes. I use ones from Arteza, but you can get these from your local craft supply store. And you can also get some great brushes that work well with watercolor from Walmart if you wanted to. I have some of those that I like to use whenever I don't feel like using a water brush. I'm coming in before I blend anything out with a little bit lighter color of brown here. I'm just scribbling some of that on. You do not want to use a rough hand here. You don't want to put indentions in your paper because then it's not going to blend out for you. Now my darkest color I used very sparingly. Then I came in with a little bit heavier hand, and I'll actually add a little bit more of my medium color. And then for my very lightest color, I'm going to fill in all those white spaces. The thing to know about your watercolor pencils is they do not have a ton of pigment. These are something you need to build up. They're not going to be like if you've used Inktense pencils. They will not have that much pigment in them at all. So you need to be aware that these are going to really be a more muted coloring medium than what you might be used to. Now once I have the color where I want it, I'm going to go ahead and bring in my water brush and just start blending out that color. Now I like to go in back and forth motions. I find that that works best for this coloring medium, and you can see these don't blend out a ton, but you do get a nice flat color wash just by blending them back and forth. And I like to go into the back and forth motion, especially with larger pieces like I did with the sand, because that is going to allow for a more flat wash instead of circular wash, which in the water that I'm going to do in a moment, the circular wash does look a little bit better, but in a flat wash, go back and forth straight across. Now for the little seaweed, I'm going to be using some green. I just scribbled down a little bit of color, and I will quickly blend that out. And then I'm going to come in on my anchor and use some gray. Now again, I am just very quickly scribbling down some color here, making sure not to apply a lot of pressure because then it's going to get stuck in your paper and those indentions. It's not going to want to move. Another thing that I want to mention is that if you are going to use these, you cannot use them on straight cardstock. You have got to use them on watercolor paper. They will not work on plain cardstock. They just won't. So make sure you have a nice watercolor paper. I'm using the Arteza watercolor paper, but you can use the Distress watercolor paper, whatever you have on hand. Just use a watercolor paper. Now I went ahead and tested out my blue here to make sure it matched the background that I went ahead and sponged on with my Distress ink. So now I'm going to come in and create some water around the top of this little panel that I have going on here. So I went ahead and I'm going to scribble on some circles. I'm using a circular motion for this. Water is a little bit more fluid, so you do have a little bit of time or a little bit more leeway playing around with this than the sand. Now I went more heavier handed towards the stamped images and towards the sand line that I created with a micron pen. And then I'll go and just quickly scribble in some color towards the top and go lighter towards the very top. Again, I'm using my water brushes to quickly blend this out, and that embossing is really helping me to go very quickly on this scene and not have to wait for dry time in between all of these. Whenever you use just a flat ink that doesn't have any erased portions to it like the embossing does, then you can't go in straight away and start painting right next to something. You're going to get some bleed between the two colors. So that embossing is a way for me to move quickly from one object to the next. Now another great technique with your water brushes is to take a little bit of color from the tip and deepen up some of those areas that you want to, like I just did there. I show all of that in that video in the review, so if you want to check that out, again, I left that link in the top right hand corner. You just need to click that little eye and you will find it. I want to add some bubbles that you normally see in water, and there is a bubble, like a little group of 3 bubbles in this stamp set that you can use, but I'm just going to draw them in very quickly with my micron pen. I'm drawing straight over the watercolor that I've done. It is dry now, but this is a waterproof pen that I'm using here. I'll leave links, and I always leave links to all of the supplies, the main supplies that I use down in the description box. So if you have any questions, you can always go down there and find the products that I use. But a lot of them that I use, people probably already have on hand. Now for the little bubbles, I'm going to come in and actually dot them with acrylic paint, white acrylic paint. That's going to give me the most opaque look that I want. So I'm using a little brush here. I've got some acrylic paint on my acrylic block, and I will just dot that into each one of those little bubbles. That's going to make them a little bit more white in color, and that's really going to help them stand out. I'm not worried about covering up any of the black ink. If you wanted to, you could always dot this in and then go in after it's dried and draw a circle around your little dot if that's more of something you would want to do. But I just went in very quickly and dotted this in. Now I'm going to be stamping on my acetate. If you want to do this, and like I'm doing here, you need to have a heat embossable acetate. You cannot use anything that you have on hand. You have to have this specific product. So this is a heat embossable acetate that I'm using here. I'm using the Hello Sentiment stamp set from Joy Clair Stamps, and I have built up the phrase sending prayers. I'll be stamping with some Versamark ink, so I'll ink that up, and I have prepped my surface with my embossing bag. Just a little tip, because I did not do it, you might want to prep both the front and the back, because this stuff is like static cling central. You'll see when I dust this embossing powder on, and I am using white embossing powder here. I'll go ahead and dust that on, and I was able to get the majority of it off. The rest of it that wasn't able to get off, I just kind of hoped it would blend into the background of some bubbles, which it did, thank goodness. But the rest of it, I went ahead and just dusted off with a paintbrush that was dry, and that'll help get some of those stray powders off. Then I came in with that craft frame, put it right over my sentiment that was heat embossed, and then I'll quickly cut around that with some scissors. That is the easiest way I found to do this, so your embossing powder doesn't get stuck underneath those die cuts like it sometimes does. Mine always does that if I try to put on a die cut and then heat emboss. It never works out for me. So that's the easiest way I have found to do this. Now to build my shaker frame, I'm using fun foam and double-sided adhesive. So I want to go ahead and make sure that I put on fun foam on the entire back of the frame, and there are no openings, no gaps whatsoever. I'm using glitter here. It is a chunkier glitter. It's the distress glitter, but still, that stuff will fall out of the smallest gaps. So you want to make sure that you have pressed your fun foam or your whatever you're using up against each other pretty snugly and you don't have any of those gaps. You could always do a double layer if you wanted to. I'm just doing one. I don't prefer to do a double layer because that's just a little bit too much dimension for me. But if you wanted this to shake around a little bit more freely, you could. Also, I did not do it, but another great tip is to go in with your embossing bag around the frame. That's going to keep the static cling down. You'll see I do have a little bit of static. It's nothing unmanageable, but still, if I would have used my embossing bag, it wouldn't be there. So I poured in some distress glitter and some sequins just that are clear. And then on the back of this, I'm going to go ahead and put another piece of acetate right over the top. Before I fill up my frames, I like to take off the backing of the glue. I put in the stuff and then taken the backing paper off my adhesive, and sometimes it'll give a little flick, and then my glitter or my sequins come crashing out, and then they get stuck to the sides, and it's just a big mess. So I like to take off my adhesive backing first, put in my filler, and then I put over another piece of clear acetate, in this case because I'm going to be placing it in a certain exact position on my card. On the back of that scene that I created on the watercolor paper, the inside of that frame, I went ahead and put some double-sided adhesive. I'll place that in the center of my card base. Then I have put more adhesive on the back of the, or I'm doing that now, on the clear piece. And this is just going to allow me to hold those sequins and that glitter in place as I flip this over and line it up to go over that inside die cut. This is a very, very easy way to make sure that everything is lined up perfectly, but you don't have any spilling out of your sequins or anything. You could, if you wanted to, if you don't want to use up that extra piece of acetate, you could put down your center first, then very, very, very carefully sprinkle in your glitter, your sequins, whatever. Make sure you don't have any overhang. And then you could take your little frame with your fun foam and your double-sided adhesive on the back and flip that over and place it over your die cut, and that will secure everything in that way. I just think it's easier to do it this way, but by all means you can do it that other way. And there you've got a little shaker card all ready to go. I absolutely love the way this turned out, and it was inspired by that picture that I first showed you. Here's a few pictures of it. Now, I love the outside of this card, but I have to say I love the inside just as much, if not maybe a little bit more, because of its simplicity. And I want to use the outside of this card as kind of like a template for another, or the inside of this card for the outside of another card. But I'm going to show you how I made the inside very quickly. If all you wanted to see was the shaker card, you can cut the video off here because that is all done, and I'll thank you for watching. But if you want to see how I made the inside, you can stick around. I am using the same stamps that I used before, but then I'm also going to be using that God's Got This sentiment. That's from the Faith Quotes stamp set from Clair Stamps. It's from their Color by Faith series. I have used this before quite a few times. I'll leave a link to a video in the top right hand corner where I use this set. And if I have any more, I'll leave them linked down below as well. Then from that Anchor of Hope stamp set, I'm pulling out one of those waves, and I'm going to stamp that right above. I stamped the anchor off to the left side of the God's Got This verse, or saying, I guess is what you would call it. And then I'm going to come in and draw the rest of my scene with my micron pen. Now, this doesn't play well with colored pencils and OMS that I'm going to be using for this. It plays well with colored pencils, but once you add in that OMS, it wants to smear a little bit. So I just stay away from my micron lines. I drew them very thin. I can always go back in and thicken them up later if I wanted to. I used VersaFine Nocturne ink, the VersaFine Clair ink, and that plays very well. I did a video on that as well, of all the coloring mediums it plays well with. I'll leave that in the top right hand corner if I have room. If not, it'll be down in the description box. But I am going to be using the colored pencils now from Leisure Arts. I am super quickly scribbling in some color with some blues and some browns. I use gray in the anchor, And then I will very, very quickly use my blending step and OMS. I just spilled it. If you didn't see, I knocked it over because I'm very, very clumsy and I work in a tiny space. It's bound to happen at some point. But I'm going to very, very quickly blend all this out. And I am not going full color here. I am going very much minimal coloring and a lot of white space. I'm really making sure to blend those edges out and almost fade them into nothing and white. That is my goal. So again, just very, very, very little bit of color just right next to the lines that are in the stamps. So you can see I did just the waves. I did just the part where the ocean would meet the sand, and then just the very top of the sand, and then the little bit of line under the anchor I'll blend out. I also added some gray to the anchor, and that will be all the color that you'll see. And I love the simplistic look of this. I really want to take this design and put it on the front of a card. I think it'd be so easy to create a set of those, especially for like your church or something. So super quick and easy to do one of those, and one layer goes through the mail so easily. But that does it for me today. If you guys stuck around to the end of this, I want to thank you so very much for watching this long video. As always, there are going to be a few links on the left side of your screen you can click on. Thanks for watching, and happy crafting.